Hello and welcome to this episode of our Talk Africa Plus podcast. Today, we examine how the conflict in the Middle East is affecting countries far beyond the region, including here in Africa. And jumping straight into it, Africa is definitely feeling the brunt of this conflict. Higher fuel prices, disrupted trade, diplomatic pressures, and so much more. This is clearly not a distant problem. And to unpack it all, I am joined today by Douglas Okwach, a senior editor of the weekly Talk Africa show. Douglas?
Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure once again to be here.
And I also have next to Douglas, Robert Nagila, a senior reporter here at CGTN Africa. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you for having me, Jerry.
And I'm going to start straight with you, Robert. You have reported extensively on this war since it broke out. What really is the latest that we should focus on, right now as a continent?
Thank you once again. I think that as a continent, there's a couple of things we have to focus on. One, first, the economic impact on Africa as this conflict goes on. The longer it goes on, it's really not good. And the second one is the security aspect, the security impact of this conflict on Africa. Those are the two main areas. Now, of course, when you talk about economic impact, you're going to break it down. But primarily economic impact, let's start first with things like gas and oil prices. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, which at the moment appears to be the center of controversy in this conflict where ships are not going through, that strait itself, you've got about 20% of global oil that passes through that particular strait. Now, with the strait more or less closed, you've got hardly any oil going through, and that is posing a major problem, especially for Africa. Now, with oil prices now going up, the impact of that is felt almost immediately because that translates to there's a ripple effect, basically. So you've got transport costs also going up, which has an impact on the price of commodities, which has an impact on the cost of living, inflation, and so on and so on. So it has a direct link to the person on the ground, and that is felt almost immediately. Now, you've got to also understand that African governments at the moment have budgetary pressures. Okay, because there's not enough spending on development areas, health, and so on. And then you've got this conflict as well. So it's a tough balancing act for them. So there's a lot more pressure coming in for African governments with these things. And then still on the economic aspect of it, you've got, let's look at food production. Let's take that as one of it. Now, much of Africa imports quite a bit of its fertilizer from the Middle Eastern countries. We know that Middle Eastern countries are more or less closed for business because they are dealing with the Israel, America, Iran conflict. They've more or less been sucked into it. You've seen almost daily attacks in United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia has also suffered some attacks, Bahrain, Qatar, and so on. Now, globally, I think we're looking at about 12% of fertilizer coming from the Middle East, a lot of it making its way to Africa. Now, one of the reasons for that is because you've got this cheap fossil gas, or rather cheap fossil fuel in the Middle East, which is then used to make nitrogen-based fertilizer and phosphate-based fertilizer, which we use a lot here on the continent. Now, the conflict has succeeded in disrupting trade, energy, supplies, and supply chains across the entire region, Horn of Africa, and much of the rest of Africa as well. So what does this do? The fact that we're not getting enough fertilizer here is going to affect food production. That is a huge headache for governments across Africa, because already food security was a major problem, especially with the crisis in Sudan. We know that the humanitarian situation there has been described as the worst humanitarian situation we've seen in decades by the United Nations. So this is only going to get worse, especially with much of the world focused on this particular conflict in the Middle East. So that is just one aspect of something that is creating a lot of concerns along the corridors in many African capitals.
Thank you, Robert. And Douglas, when you look at some of the things that have been happening now with regards to the conflict that's happening in Iran, of course, perpetrated by Israel and the US, you get a feeling that at the very beginning, most analysts would have reported that they expected it to last very short term, rather, not really take too long for these two sides to achieve the objectives for this particular conflict that they started. But then now we have gone so many days beyond the objectives that they were thinking they would have had, or rather the results that they were hoping to get. They're really not getting those results as it is up to this particular point. On your weekend show, you delved into this quite a lot. You are looking at some of the things that have unfolded so far in Iran and how now they're affecting the whole region and how that is spilling over into Africa. So I'm just curious to know now, what did you unpack from that show particularly that stood out for you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jerry. Before I go into that, first of all, I think there is an issue here of really underestimating Iran by the United States going in there, because I think completely against advice and of course without consultations. So it was a unilateral decision made without Congress approval, of course, not even involving the UN Security Council. The initial goals, as we had it, as was being reported, as analysts have always said it, is that the US went in there to take out nuclear and missile, Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities.
Which they have always said they don't have.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, which they say they don't have. Actually, which they actually also say that they had completely obliterated in that other attack the previous year. But then also, while at it, we also hear things about regime change, that the US went in there for purposes of regime change, basically trying to replicate what it did in Venezuela the other day. But then Iran begins to look like a totally different proposition because the US initial thinking was that we weaken the regime, and then we have, Donald Trump kept saying it, then we have the people take charge of their own country. In other words, the US hoped to incite a revolution against the Iranian regime by that attack. So initially, we hear about nuclear infrastructure, missile capabilities, regime change. So even those goals kept shifting. And then the objectives began to get blurred. Of course, so then they thought they would go in there quickly and get out quickly. But of course, I think also experience tells us that that has not always been the case in trying to get into some of these Middle Eastern countries. I think countries like Afghanistan, where we witnessed the most chaotic US departure a while back when the Taliban actually eventually marched into and took over Kabul, is a big reminder of the complete, underestimation of the capabilities of some of these countries to resist. And Iran is just proving so. However, Jerry, before we move on to the next question, I think Robert really unpacked this economic issue very well. But I'd like to talk about the paradoxes. One of the paradoxes for me is energy scarcity. While we have almost 10 African countries producing crude. So I'm always curious to the question of as to just what happens to our crude. Where do we take our oil? So that when a war breaks out in a totally different geographical location from Africa, Africa begins to suffer. I think this is a very pertinent question. And the answer probably is also very well known. And then even the question of food scarcity, Robert. Why should we be food insecure? And really Africa has the world's largest proportion of arable land left. Almost 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa. So why do we always remain food insecure? And I think Ukraine was supposed to have taught us some lessons, but time has gone by, and we are beginning to realize that we didn't learn too much. And of course, when you talk about agriculture, it's not just about food security, it's also about jobs. Many African countries, including Kenya, I think for a while the largest contributor to their GDP was agriculture. And agriculture also is the largest employer. So when we talk about lack of inputs like fertilizers, we're talking about low productivity, which will then again, of course, translate into food scarcity and food shortages. But then there will also be job losses. So when it comes to agriculture and energy, I think Africa is a real paradox for me.
No, I honestly do agree. And I think despite the fact that this conflict, the longer it goes on, is going to have a huge impact on various sectors within the African continent, I agree with you. It also gives us an opportunity to stop, take a step back and reflect and re-strategize. It gives us an opportunity to change the way we go about doing things around the continent. We've been talking about the Africa Free Trade Continental Area for dozens of years. A lot of things have been signed left, right, and center. However, the implementation is where we seem to have slowed on this particular project, which is, by all accounts, when you listen to everyone speak about it, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And what it can deliver for the continent is absolutely brilliant. So this is the time now to say, fine, first of all, let's open up our skies. Let's open up our borders. Let's see where we can collaborate closer. You've got Nigeria, the largest refinery, now oil refinery across the continent. Algeria, Nigeria, and Angola alone should be able to provide enough oil for much of this continent. So we need to rethink as well how we approach working together within the African continent.
Nigeria already started refining.
Oh yeah,
Nigeria
absolutely,
started refining, and of
absolutely.
course, I think that's a game changer
Yes,
for
it is.
Africa.
Yes, and also the impact that the Dangote refinery is having in the country and the potential that it also could have all across the continent. I think, as you mentioned, Robert, they should be able, of course, working together with Algeria and Angola to provide enough fuel
For much of the continent.
For much of the continent.
Absolutely. And also, I was talking about fertilizer earlier. Now, there's some countries have already taken steps inadvertently, because nobody knew that this conflict was coming, had already taken steps to start being self-reliant on things like fertilizer. Kenya, for example, is building, I think, this geothermal-powered fertilizer plant about 100 kilometers from where we are in Naivasha. This was launched, I think, about 2-3 months ago by the president. And when it's up and running, it's going to be able to provide, I think, 95% of our fertilizer needs. So that means that what we're importing now, I think more than 500,000 metric tons of fertilizer or something annually, that will more or less stop. So we're becoming self-reliant. If we're able to produce more, we'll be able to then sell it off to our neighboring countries. And I think we need to see more of that within the continent.
Then, Robert, really, this fertilizer, again, if you look at the Middle Eastern story, it's a byproduct. The nitrogen that we use is a byproduct, actually, of the refining that these oil refineries do, which then would mean that Africa doesn't necessarily need to import fertilizer.
That was actually the idea of the Kaishan plant that you're talking about in Naivasha. So they are planning to produce geothermal power. But then now the waste that they're going to get by producing the power that they will produce there, they're proposing to use it to produce fertilizer, yes, which then will power the country's agricultural sector. And I think that is one of the ways that we really need to work towards going further, not just in Kenya, but also on the continent. But staying on that bit, looking at the economic impact that this war is having on Africa. Of course, now we're just looking at how jobs internally here are affected. But there are also the millions probably of Africans that work outside of the continent, in the Middle East, the people who work on the menial jobs and even the technical jobs that the Middle Eastern countries come and source from Africa. Those talents, they are also affected in a big way. The businesses that operate in Africa but have roots in the Middle East, they're also going to be affected. We also have the exports that come from Africa into the Middle East. You're looking at food products. Let's say Kenya exporting tea to Iran, for example. Now that is cut out. And we're going to talk about that in a major way. But I just want us to listen to an excerpt from your weekend show, Douglas, which, remember, was also talking about this same issue. And you had a guest on the show. That's Zinat Adam, who is the Deputy Executive Director, Afro Middle East Center. This is what she had to say.
The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is going to have massive reverberations across the world, and we're already feeling that in terms of the oil price increase. And we know that the Energy Agency has announced that they will be tapping into the oil reserves in order to try and mitigate against that massive oil increase that is expected. But as Dr. Mustafa has indicated, beyond that, you're also looking at the derivatives out of the oil and gas industry that affect Africa in the fertilizers and in terms of our food security.
Food security, and that's already, in your show, that's already part of the discussion that is held there. And as Dr. Zinat says, it's something that really needs to be looked at closely. So how are we affected? Just give me a breakdown of how these countries in Africa, of course, they are the countries that really major on agriculture as a main source of their economic standing. How are they going to be affected? And long term, how does it then affect the continent?
I think you can look at it in terms of the phases of the crisis. I think the most immediate crisis is food prices, because then you'll find that some African countries rely solely on imports for their food security. So the food crisis that this war on Iran has generated is going to begin to have direct impact on many African countries, and this is going to really hit them below the belt, because it's about family income. Many families depend on their very scarce resources to put on food on the table. So at the family level, it is already creating a crisis where sometimes at some point when this crisis continues to unfold, 3 meals per day on the table might begin to be a challenge because of the high food prices. But mid-term, we may begin to see longer term, impacts on even the contribution of agriculture to the GDP of countries, particularly countries that are dependent on agriculture for their growth. So this impact means that the government revenue will be lowered. Then, of course, in the long term, just like we realized post-COVID, the agricultural sector may have to undergo a policy, sort of reform, in order to make it less dependent. I think the issue here for me as an African watching this crisis is that we are over-dependent on some of these countries. We saw what happened in Ukraine, and now we are also seeing what's happening in the Middle East. So we need to wean ourselves off this dependence on foreign agricultural imports as a source of our food security.
And then also you're looking at the shipping costs now. A lot of countries have been forced now to seek alternative shipping routes for the products that they want to sell into Africa or they want to export into Africa. And this, of course, affects the African nations in terms of the costs that, whether it's food products, whether it's any other usables that come into the continent. Of course, that cost is going to be passed on to the local citizenry here in Africa. Robert, how then should we find a balance between, survival in the middle of this war that is happening and, of course, is already affecting a majority of the continent?
Jerry, that's a difficult one because it goes right down to policy, okay? And how countries come up with policy to dictate their foreign exchange, for example. If you look at the entire African continent in 2024, I think remittances from the Gulf was over $100 billion in 2024. That's a lot of money, which has a huge impact in so many sectors on the ground here in Africa. You've got countries like Uganda, I think, had about 300,000 or so nationals working in the Gulf. Kenya had, I think, one of the largest populations, about 500,000 nationals working in the Gulf. And most of them, from what I know at this particular point in time, are still there. because a lot of them are hoping to ride this wave out and then get on to their jobs, because they have to then, their families are dependent on them, and that's why they're trying to see if they can ride this out, and then hopefully things will get back to some semblance of normality. We don't know. But from that $500,000, I think remittances from there for Kenya was about almost $8 billion, okay, which directly impacts a person on the ground, going towards helping family members, relatives, whatever, in health. But more so for the government and the country is a foreign exchange earner. So that's one of the huge, huge areas where countries are going to lose out, which makes it even more difficult for countries now to be able to purchase things like oil and so on and so forth, things that the countries import for their domestic market. So that is just one aspect of it. Or the people on the ground who directly are connected with relatives who are directly dependent on relatives for this remittances, that's a huge, huge hole. Okay, as I said earlier, governments at the moment have budgetary pressures, are not able to raise enough funds for their budgetary programs. Then now you've got here citizens also lacking in areas such as education, in areas such as health. There's also food security. So what stopgap measures do you put in place to ensure that all this citizenry are catered for, and that gap is more so filled? And of course, you'll remember that when the Trump administration second term began, cutting off all this aid and changing their model, no more free aid. What we're going to do is change it. You give us something, we give you something in return, a quid pro quo, so to speak. We've seen them come back with new. We've seen them come up with a new model on health, for example, which a lot of African countries are rejecting, because here what people are discovering is that this is just about data. It's all about data, and that's what it gets to the bottom of. So just going back to what we were, our discussion, it goes down to policy. Governments need to sit down.
Actually, Robert, let me just weigh in there
sure.
on policy.
Yeah.
I think we need to step back and really look at the importance of agriculture in the lives of Africans and African countries. If you look at some of the most developed countries today, I think agriculture, even China and most of Europe and even the United States, agriculture was sort of what started the Industrial Revolution. It was the building block. We need to begin seeing agriculture as the building block, as the foundation of the development of any country, so that even when you want to industrialize, you must fix agriculture first, because then that becomes the stepping stone to industrialization.
Absolutely.
That is the model many countries have followed. So that's number one. Number two, I'm really concerned about the question of land policy in Africa and land fragmentation. If you look closely across many African countries, agricultural land has slowly diminished. Of course, we have climate change and other issues, but agricultural land has slowly given way to settlements.
Kenya is a good example.
Yeah, to settlements. So that the proportion of land that is now farmed versus the proportion of land that is now settled on is beginning to become very disproportionate. And I think this is going to be a very big challenge in future, and particularly in the face of the crisis like the ones we are already seeing. So what then can we do? I think there are countries in Africa where land, I don't know what policy Ethiopia has, but it appears to be having a different policy, say, for example, from Kenya in terms of land ownership. So the fragmentation means less and less land and agriculture. So the efficiency Jerry was talking about begins to be very elusive, because even in terms of efficiency, I think it's more efficient farming 100 acres of maize, farming 100 acres of sugarcane. Then it becomes, the cost of production per unit becomes smaller. And even in terms of machinery, it becomes more efficient. So we are seeing fragmentation, we are seeing a very costly way of production, and agriculture is just beginning to slowly slip out of our hands. I think this crisis like this, offer an opportunity for a rethink for Africans, because look ahead, say in 2050, when, like today in many African countries, less than 50% or 30% of the land is under agriculture. What is likely to happen 50 years, 20 years down the line? Food is going to be the key thing. And we always talk about African sovereignty. I do not know where we are going to get our sovereignty when we cannot be food secure. Yeah, so this is a very big issue. And I think this Gulf War, this war in the Middle East, should be a big lesson for us to rethink our land policy, to rethink our agricultural policies. Countries like India here have gone big time in amalgamation, putting together fragments, bits and pieces of land that were, cut, putting them together and beginning some sort of organized farming. So this is a big issue for me.
And then there's also the risk of, I would take it at this point, there's the risk of, a lot of African countries still give subsidies to their citizens, whether it's in terms of food production and cost, whether it's in terms of fuel. So with this conflict and, of course, with the impact that we're already seeing, whether it's mid-term, whether it's long-term, whether it's short-term, do we run the risk of now a lot of these governments also doing away with subsidies totally? And then where does that leave the Africans? Because now the cost of fuel is going to rise even higher than it is right now. The cost of food production, the cost of even business is going to be much, much higher. That is, of course, going to leave a lot of Africans at risk of, not being able to afford certain things in life, Robert.
Well, let me see if I can answer that this way. With this current conflict bearing on the entire global economy, okay? And we've seen that the price of Brent oil is past $100 already, okay? And there are no signs that it's letting up at the moment. It's putting a lot of pressure on the markets. The markets have been losing out for the last week or so, well, since this war started, really. So it's having an impact on the global markets, okay? Which also means that there is a direct trickling effect on African markets as well. The pressure is now being felt. The markets are not doing as well as they were about a month ago. So it's having a huge... Now, at this particular moment, most governments are all focused within, okay? How to prop up their economies, make sure that they're able to cushion any underlying effects so that they're able to cushion their populations. So we're not going to get much help outside there. Unfortunately, we were already stretched, okay? So this is where now you need your best brains in government to sit down and say, okay, fine, this is our forecast for the next, if this carries on for the next couple of weeks, 2 weeks, this is our forecast. These are the interventions we need to do. Can African governments really afford subsidies at this particular moment, especially when they have budgetary pressures? I don't think so. Where's that extra money, moolah, as they would say? Where is it coming from? Okay.
But Robert, I think I think subsidies looks like is inevitable, because then you need to cushion people against inflationary, prices. Otherwise, you'll have a crisis in your hands, because if the pump price is completely, it's gone skyward, what do we do in order to make people afford the pump price? So it means we must subsidize.
But in a country, let's say, in a situation like Kenya here, where the government has already rolled out multi-billion projects that are already straining the government, and the government has actually come into the pockets of taxpayers even more, and they're taking even more money than before. How then do you then come back to these people and tell them that now we might have to not subsidize this, or we might have to again subsidize this, but if we subsidize this, we might have to let go of our housing program.
I think we are dealing with a crisis. We are dealing with a crisis, and then therefore, long-term projects like those infrastructure programs you're talking about,
they're not priorities.
Yeah, are not a priority in the face of a crisis. So
Douglas is right, because you look at, I think Ethiopia, for example, Ethiopia has already introduced some subsidies to cushion its. So, and that's why I was saying
even Egypt did during the Ukraine crisis.
And Tanzania is now trying to increase its strategic fuel reserves. We've seen Zambia warning people, oil marketers, no more hoarding. And this is why I'm saying that now you need your best brains to say, fine, this is the forecast. What are our priorities? Okay, these mega projects are not priorities at the moment. Food's on tables. We need fuel. Those are the priorities. So subsidies, Eventually. We have a system where we're supposed to be cushioned in a way. It's rather complicated, but could you call our system subsidies? I don't know, Dag.
Yeah, you see, like even the fertilizer, I think the fertilizer is a very good example. I think since last year, I think the government has always offered subsidized fertilizers to farmers to bring down the cost of inputs. And I totally have no problem with that, because even the European farmers are heavily subsidized. And that's the reason, really, because of that heavy subsidization. That is why you find that when their products get into our supermarket shelves, they are way more cheaper than ours, which are produced at a much higher cost, much higher and subsidized cost. So, for example, a kilo of sugar from Mumias in Kenya might be more costly than a kilo of sugar from Brazil. Basically going back to that same story of, cost per unit of production. So when the product is produced at a high cost, the shelf price will also be very high. And this really tends to create inflation, and many governments can have a crisis in their hands. I remember the other year we had riots in Sierra Leone.
Oh, yes.
And even in Kenya we had the Sufuria.
Oh, yes. And
yeah, so this is something, this is a crisis governments must manage and, of course, make it a priority.
And just to add on to what Doug is saying, in times of crisis, that's when the population actually you need your government to stand up and say, you know what, we've got this. We will cushion you from this fall. We're going to take a beating, but that's where you look at what is the priority, okay? You need to know what your priorities are, what are not your priorities, and that's where you have to balance your budget. That's where you take money from one side, put it on the other side, and say, look, we don't really need this at this time. What we need is food on the table. So you have to be able to work out that balance.
And we saw that during, I think, the previous Kenyan administration, where the government, during the COVID time, came in and subsidized fuel. They even reduced taxes a bit in terms of the income taxes that people were imposed on. And all there were a couple of subsidies that were given. And I think it was a big relief to the Kenyans at that time, because jobs were scarce and all this impact of the COVID was really hitting people hard. But then I'm going to just try to shift a bit. You talked earlier on about some policy that the government should really be focusing on, and you even talked about using the best African brains to try and turn this around, to try and get Africa in the best position, to survive this period. But it also reminds me of a show that you did back in the days on Talk Africa, Douglas, looking at the brain drain, looking at how Africa is losing some of its best brains outside the continent, and you are asking, are they willing to come back? And if they're not willing to come back, what would stop them? Do you think then that it is time, probably the people who might be affected, even in the Middle East, as you are saying, there's still a lot of people there, and some of them, it's not just menial jobs that they go to do there. There are people who go there to do, technical stuff. It's very, very, very highly skilled jobs. Would they find a place if they came back to, help Africa survive?
Yeah, I think, Jerry, that's a very good question, and it raises many issues. For example, the idea of globalization. We were always told that globalization means we are now one. The global community, the world community, is now one big village, and the idea of globalization then meant for me, and of course, many people who follow the concept that borders, walls, and all sorts of restrictions in terms of movement of people, movement of skills, movement of services, and even trade, movements of goods and services was free. That a Kenyan expert, a Kenyan professional, is just as free as a Tanzanian professional, to seek their fortunes in Europe or in the Middle East. So that's one thing. But I've always thought that two things have shortchanged Africa. One of them is the idea of globalization, which also came with the idea of free markets and liberalization. I may be wading into very controversial territory here, but I must confess that some of the challenges Africa started facing go as far back as the 1970s, when some people came here and told us that we cannot do textile, that textile isn't our comparative advantage. When some people came here and told us we cannot make leather shoes because that is not a comparative advantage, they told us that we can look for our comparative advantage in other areas, that other people. Then we opened the floodgates. We opened our borders for all sorts of things to come into our countries. And then we killed our industries. Those years I'm talking about, the unemployment crisis, of course, this is also in tandem with population growth. You know, some of these crises are also a function of population. So we had plenty of factories. We had a lot of manufacturing going on, and job creation. So this floodgate, this brain drain you are talking about, is an issue of lack of opportunities in Africa for Africans. Many of them with the required skill sets for these jobs, but those jobs are not there. And in fact, before this show, I was just looking at the unemployment figures of many African countries, and some of the figures go as high as 30%. It means like 2/3. Slightly, almost a third of the population cannot get a job. And you can imagine the number of young people that we churn out of our universities every year. So while we look at it as brain drain, it's a question of, do the opportunities exist? And the answer to me is that those opportunities don't exist. So you find Africans scattered across the globe, and even in the Middle East, to look for jobs. And like I said about agriculture, this again is an opportunity for us, that although we are in a globalized world where the movement of skills, the movement of people, the movement of services go across borders, but we also really need to think about times of crisis like this, that what then happens. But away even from crisis, if we open our doors the way we did to other products from other countries into our economies, if we open our doors to all our young people with all those skill sets, so who will develop our country? So this is an area in which Africa finds itself in a dilemma.
Nice. I want to shift this discussion a bit now into geopolitics and look at Africa's standing with regard to the global politics. And my entry into this is going to, again, be an excerpt from your weekend show, Douglas. And this time I want to look at something that Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, who is the founder and chairman of Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, said. And here is what he had to say.
Geopolitically, there are realignments going on. You can see South Africa, for example, is condemned the illegal and immoral attack on Iran. And you see countries like Kenya, for example, which is neutral in some ways, but have condemned attack on its Gulf allies, particularly the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar.
Robert, I'm starting with you again here. What is Africa's standing when it comes to these kind of matters?
Jerry, I'll give you $100 if you're able to tell me that one. I don't think anyone, because I think we would be looking towards the African Union for a stand that represents a unified stand that represents the entire continent. We've not really seen that. I know that the African Union, in all fairness, has come out and condemned the conflict and the damage that it's doing to the global economy and the deaths of citizens in the Middle East as well. We've seen individual countries come out with their own individual positions, so it's not really a joint or unified stand. However, we've also seen, as Dr. Mustafa was just saying in that recording you were playing just now, the realignments of many countries, starting in the Gulf. which had started way before even this current conflict against Iran, because we know that the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, they're all involved in the Horn of Africa and all have tentacles that spreading to many countries across Africa. And these are economic engagements, security-wise, and trade. Okay, especially because of this desire to control trade along the Red Sea corridor, which is along their coast. So that makes more sense. However, the geopolitics part of it is also playing out. We've seen realignment, for example, Sudan has accused, and the United Nations panel of experts has accused the United Arab Emirates of supporting the paramilitary rapid support forces in the Sudanese conflict. So has the Sudan government. The United Arab Emirates has denied it. We've seen that this has led to issues with Somalia, Somaliland as well. We've seen Israel also a new entrant into by recognizing Somaliland. We've seen Saudi Arabia also now beginning to say, hey, hang on a second, what's going over there, and wanting a piece of the action. We've seen Turkey also heavily involved with Somalia. It used to be with Sudan, but that's changed somewhat. So there's realignments, not just there in the Gulf, but here as well amongst these countries, Ethiopia as well. Now, the question is, for me, I'm looking at, yes, this is the current situation at the moment. What happens once the conflict ends in the Middle East? Are we going to see further realignment here? Are we going to see some countries like the United States, for example? We know that they are trying to make significant strides, especially in the Sahel, and here within Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, this thing of diplomacy for minerals, and the Trump administration has been huge on that kind of trade. Are we going to see now that the United States influence reduced once this conflict ends, or are they going to focus their influence more on particular areas within the continent? Okay, that still needs to play out. The situation in Sudan as well. What's going to happen? Are we going to see reduced support for the paramilitary rapid support forces, the alleged support? Are we going to see the Sudanese armed forces gaining an upper hand? Is that conflict finally going to come to an end? Are we going to see developments at the Horn of Africa, the Djibouti, Somalia? So all this is something that we need to watch closely, because I think what's happening in the Middle East is going to be heavily impacted here. There are analysts who now believe that when this conflict finally does come to an end, hopefully soon, we're going to see the United States influence in that region greatly reduced. That remains to be seen. But you have also to remember that one of the things that has happened over the years with American influence in that region is it has brought up these middle tier powers. Okay, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and so on, Qatar, and so on. Iraq is now also coming back up. So, and all these people are all there scrambling for some sort of influence outside their sphere, the spheres that they control. And that's why we see them heavily in the Horn of Africa and now also increasing further. So those are things to watch out for once this conflict ends. What is the impact? Now remember as well that there are some countries, Kenya, for example, South Africa, and a number of other countries that had taken positions before this conflict on the geopolitics within the region and during this conflict as well. Now, are those positions going to change because the major allies, so to speak, are reducing their influence, and then you have to look towards new allies as well? We've seen that already. The United States is having a problem with its NATO member states, okay, with its European allies who have clearly said, look, you want us to come and police the Strait of Hormuz. This is not our conflict. Okay, you went in, as Doug rightly said in the beginning, they went in alone. They did not consult the United Nations. They did not form any coalitions. They went in alone. But now that things are not working out as well as they anticipated they would, they're suddenly looking and say, hey, can you guys come in? And I just want to, forgive me if this take you away for a couple of seconds. You remember when Russia first went into Ukraine? And at that time, the thinking was that we're going to be there for about a week and we'll have taken over and done. And that was the expectation at this time. The objectives kept shifting. But the Americans and everyone said, no, we're going to end this on our terms. We think that we're not going to be there very long. It will be over. No, that's not what happened, is it?
Yeah, yeah. I think Jerry, Robert has captured it very well. But the question of to be or not to be aligned, to be or not to be
Yes.
aligned.
Can we afford to be neutral as a continent, first of all?
Yeah. Let me give you the example of the great Nelson Mandela, the guy who said, "You cannot choose for us our friends." I think when some people from the Western world was pushing him about some country and its leader, and whether South Africa should have identified with that country or not. So in this conversation, Robert, South Africa is really an example to emulate. And I can see that we talk about countries that condemned.
They were among the first, weren't they?
Yes,
Yeah.
countries that condemned. But we also talk about countries that took what we call strategic neutrality and called for restraint.
Yes.
Now, South Africa usually it always knows where it should stand, whether it was Israel-Gaza, you saw quickly the position it took. But this question of to be or not to be aligned, for me, is an issue of sovereignty. It's a question of sovereignty, which African countries grapple with.
Can I ask you a
Are
question?
we
Dan?
sovereign, you know?
Yes. Or just on what you're talking about.
Even as we agree that international relations is about interests, that
Yeah.
countries pursue their interests. Yes, Robert.
So sorry to interrupt you, but on what you've just said, my question to you is this, Doug. Is it historical? That's why it takes these positions that are much admired across the continent, standing for those who are facing injustice and for standing for just. Is it historical, or is it also the fact that it is a major power in Africa, economically, militarily? Where do you think this comes from?
I think in the Cold War era, we had the principle of non-alignment. Of course, for South Africa, there are also historical reasons. You know, during the long period of apartheid, when South Africa was under isolation for many years, there are countries that stood with the liberation fighters, the liberation fighters of South Africa. And when South Africa came out of that oppressive period, South Africa never forsook, never forgot. And when you talk about these countries, you talk about countries, one of them is Russia. And you know the East and West divide. So South Africa always remembers the countries that stood with it during apartheid. So that's historical. So because of shared experiences also, South Africa knows where it needs to stand when it comes to Palestine.
Absolutely.
Because Palestine, in South Africa's understanding, in South Africa's view, is an apartheid issue. The same experience they had for many, many years. So it's historic. South Africa sometimes appears to be the leader in Africa, away from the African Union. So for me, it's a sovereignty issue. However, we must recognize that when countries were making pronouncements soon after these attacks happened, soon after Israel and the US attacked Iran, I think they were looking at their interests. And you captured it very well, Robert, when you looked at the countries that condemned Iran. You'll see how aligned they are with the Gulf cooperation countries in terms of trade, economic interests, in terms of political interests, in terms of security interests. So countries pursue their interests in the international arena. However, there are also those that take a strategic, like they call it, neutrality and call for restraint. And I think that's where we have Nigeria and Ghana in all this mix. Historically, you'll also, and I think you mentioned it, when you look at Somalia, for example, you will understand why it will condemn or take sides. Of course, Israel the other day recognized Somaliland, which is sovereign part of Somalia, and then of course you can understand where Somalia is coming from in this conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have the non-aligned principle, which some African countries follow, and which South Africa has adhered to for years. And of course, we also know that countries in the international arena just pursue their interests.
Yeah.
I am economically aligned to this country, so I cannot forsake it in its time of need, because I will always need it. And when you look at the engagement of some of these Gulf states in the Horn of Africa, as you mentioned, you'll understand the security and the economic interest there. And of course, we see even Qataris, the other day, joining the search for peace in the DR Congo. Qatar has a partnership with Rwanda in terms of Rwanda, So when Rwanda speaks, when Qatar is under attack, you can understand which position Rwanda will take.
That was a fantastic example you just gave, yes.
And as we just stay on South Africa before I let that go, just yesterday they issued a statement. Of course, they have been getting a lot of pressure to, try and distance themselves from Iran. And yesterday they issued a very strong statement saying, no, we are not going to be forced to distance ourselves from Iran. And a statement that was issued by Zen Dangor, who is the government's Director General of the Department of International Relations, particularly said, we cannot be pulled into the sort of sphere influence politics that great powers want to pull us into. And that, in this instance, includes the U.S. They're saying, yes, the U.S. is trying to get us to take a side, but you're not going to take that side because we don't have to take that side. Basically, that's what they're telling the U.S. We're not going to take a side that you want us to take. And I think you put it very clearly. South Africa has put itself in a position where it's able to take a stand that is aligned with its ideology, and that ideology has been there for decades now. You've given a very good example of Nelson Mandela, and I remember the part you're talking about where he was asked in a very heated interview why South Africa was supporting a particular country, and he said, we are not going to allow outsiders to choose our friends for us. And just because someone is someone else's enemy, that does not make that enemy of that person my enemy.
Absolutely.
So they have this history of taking their own stand rather than having to rely on someone else. And
just before you go there, I think South Africa in particular has taken a lot of heat from the U.S. because of these positions. You remember even Ukraine, Russia, and the whole idea of Malign Act. There have been initiatives in Congress, actually bipartisan initiatives in Congress, to punish South Africa legally. None of them has really worked. And I think the Malign Russia Act, which was really a very overt, strategy by the United States to prevent African countries from relating with Russia, is a very good example of how countries can be bullied, into taking sides in geopolitics or in this global contest. But South Africa is an example that stands out of principle, in spite of the bullying and threats, including economic sanctions.
And we saw that bullying, which was absolutely unbelievable, when President Cyril Ramaphosa held bilateral talks with President Trump at the White House, and he had all these charts behind him claiming that there was genocide going, and none of them were true. We're talking about one of the most powerful men in the world, who's got perhaps one of the best intelligence services globally, and yet here you are peddling all this falsehoods for all the cameras to see. And a lot of people, rightly so, across the continent were really offended and angry at that display. But President Cyril Ramaphosa, an absolute gentleman, held his own, was not moved, did not show any emotion, and I thought came out the better man. But that was one of the examples of bullying that we've seen, to the point where there was this online campaign which was actually being pushed by American officials, and they actually got some white South Africans to leave South Africa to go to the US because of this so-called genocide and killings. Well, guess what? several months later, it turns out that they want to return, at least some of them want to return back to South Africa because it's not rosy over back there in the US of A.
And even the images that you're talking about, we've even seen reports over the past month of some of the people that know about that particular story that Trump was talking about coming out and saying, you know what, that was just a memorial that was happening. It wasn't really what the president was trying to allude
Absolutely.
to. Anyway, so I think we are almost, going towards now the tail end of our discussion, and I just want to focus now on what the continent has done and what it could do. First of all, still sticking to you, Robert, are you satisfied with the kind of response that Africa has given to this conflict in terms of, even pulling out its citizens or giving statements, asking them to stay safe? Have you been satisfied with the kind of response that the continent, or rather African countries, have been giving to this conflict?
Yes and no. No, because I think, let me start with yes first. When you look at, first of all, the evacuations of citizens, I know that, like I said, Kenya has about 500,000 citizens there. Countries like South Africa have just over 6,000 citizens, Ugandan, I think 300,000 and so on. It's virtually impossible to airlift all those people. However, credit to African governments, what they did was immediately set about trying to get all their nationals registered with their embassies in affected countries. The countries like Zambia, for example, directed the embassy officials in Middle Eastern countries to come up with an immediate evacuation plan if need be. Now, you also have to look at it in this way. A lot of people are sheltering in places they have been advised. Many people still believe that once this war ends, they still have a career there. Okay, they still want to continue with the work they do there because, what we were talking about earlier, remittances, they've got dependents back here in Africa. Those remittances are also important for things like foreign exchange for African governments. So in that regard, I think they've done a lot. We've seen countries like Uganda, for example, that evacuated 42 students from Iran. When the conflict just started, it was no mean feat through Turkey via road as they were being bombed. So I think they've done a lot, okay? Now, I think the next phase is what is going to be important, and that's going to be back here on the continent in terms of what are the priorities, how do we cushion our citizens from any economic fallout, any geopolitics that's going to rise up. Now, here is where I think this is a unique opportunity that we've been given. We can make the best of this. We need to speak as one voice. We need to act as one voice, okay? We also need to realize that if we lift some of the barriers that are in place, we could make, for example, travel across this continent much cheaper, okay? It is more expensive to travel via air from one end of the continent to the other than it is to travel just outside Africa. For example, we could do some of those things to prop up our economies. We could trade more with each other, okay, to uplift trade and uplift our economies. There's a lot more we can do. Look, I'll give this example of China and the way they approach. We know that the 2 sessions, this annual gathering of lawmakers, policymakers, has just ended. Now, if you look at most of the policies they come up for the next 12 months and the next 5 years, the one thing that immediately gets you is they're always people-focused, okay? So they deal within first. Let's deal with domestically before you then look outside. Whereas here, unfortunately, there are many policies from many countries, I'm not going to name any, but from many African countries, okay, that seems to favor outside partners more than they favor the locals. And I think that needs to change. We could give, especially these countries where these deals for minerals are being done and so on and so forth, you need to ask, are they benefiting the population in any way? Or is it just a way for a country to benefit from your minerals in exchange for security guarantees, which may not be forthcoming in the first place? So I think in that regard, we could do more. I think this is a unique opportunity for Africa to start looking, okay, we're having problems outside. Why don't we start seeing, we know there's a lot of oil here, for example. There's a lot of green energy. Let's make use of that. Let's talk to each other. Let's work together. Let's see how we can solve this. We've been saying African solutions for African problems for a very long time now, okay? And I think a lot of people are actually tired of that statement. But this is a unique opportunity. Maybe we need to start looking inwards to try and solve some of this situation. As Doug has said earlier, agriculture, okay? We've got an abundance of land here up ready for cultivation, okay? Why don't we make use of that? Let's work on stopping some of these conflicts. Let's work on getting to the root causes of some of these conflicts so that we can begin to focus on the people in those particular areas, what their needs are, how to uplift their standards of living, because all these things then go to contribute towards economic growth at the end of the day. Okay, and there are countries that have actually done a brilliant job. China, I'll go back to China again. I think it's the only country globally that has uplifted more than half a billion people from extreme poverty. Okay, and they did it in a very short space of time, but it's doable. That's what China is telling you. It's doable. Of course, our circumstances are not all the same, but there are certain things we can borrow and then try and mold them towards our unique circumstances to make it work for us. Okay, and that is the message that China has been passing on. So, and I also dare say that it's one of the reasons why they're Africa's largest trading partners, as opposed to everybody else that was there before them. But it's doable if we look inwards.
Douglas, even as you're to that, could you also speak about now in terms of trade? Because you also know there's a hole that's going to be left with regard to Africa's trade with the Middle East, because now with that conflict, that trade definitely has been hit. So is it an opportunity for Africa to sort of look at how to handle trade with, other parts of the world going forward?
Yeah. I think it was that question you're asking was coming towards the tail end of my comment. I think we have Jerry, this is something we've done on Talk Africa many times, the issue of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. It came up when Africa was under onslaught, assailed by US tariffs. Africa woke up one day last year and found that tariffs were running as high as 30%. Sometimes 50%, sometimes 15%, depending on how Donald Trump felt. And when you look at countries like Lesotho, it completely obliterated the textile sector. It's a tiny African country that is completely dependent on textiles. And you saw what the US tariffs did to Lesotho. It was employing, that sector was employing people, including expatriates from the SADC region. So that sector shut down. So that's really a big lesson. Can Africa trade? Can African countries trade amongst themselves? It's a no-brainer, really. We know that it's been moving from 10%, 11%. Now latest figures tell me it's about 29%, probably moving to 30%. 54 African countries have different comparative advantages, which means trade can go on. However, why can't trade proceed at the speed and at the level we want? Because barriers still exist. Infrastructure barriers, accessing different countries in Africa is a real challenge, as we discussed when we were talking about aviation. So infrastructure barriers, let Africa fix infrastructure. China is the biggest partner here, and we know how much they have done. Now, we have the RECs, the regional economic communities. These are slowly integrating to become one big AFCFTA. We see pilot phase trials moving into full-time trade. So let's ease tariff barriers. Let's also ease non-tariff barriers. Sometimes they are really petty squabbles between African countries that result into quick meltdowns and closure of borders and very fiery exchanges. Those are totally unnecessary. I think we need to fix our relations. East African Community is one of the best examples of a regional economic group. where we just fall short of the customs union. We've done the customs union, but we still fall short of the monetary and the political union, of course, for political reasons. But I think that is the direction to move. The Trump tariffs told us so. When AGOA wasn't renewed, it even re-emphasized the need to urgently act. So then, Jerry, for me, AFCFTA in terms of trade is the way to go. 54 countries, we can trade amongst ourselves. Yes.
That's a very nice way to end it, Douglas. I know I'm out of time, yes, but...
Yeah, I wanted to, before you go, I wanted to talk about foreign policy, Jerry, before you close. And I think let Africa avoid what I can call binary alliances. Let Africa go for strategic engagements. Let's not go do proxies in a very rapidly evolving global order. Today you are here, the following day you don't know where you are. And I think the reason the Gulf countries, Gulf cooperation countries, including countries like Kuwait, Bahrain, have taken the hit is because they have allowed an enemy to use their countries as military, to put military bases there. So Africa should be very strategic. And we have nobody else to learn from than South Africa in terms of how it engages. Let's take from all sides what suits us.
That is a wonderful way to end it, Douglas. But just very briefly, I'm out of time, very briefly, what are you doing for this weekend's Talk Africa show?
This weekend's Talk Africa show, we were in Nigeria the other week. We did 2 shows there. It is a co-production with Nigeria's Channels TV. So we did 2 shows based on 2 sessions, China's biggest annual political event. So one was Nigeria-China on economic development. We ran that show the other week. The past week, of course, this other week we did Iran, Israel, and U.S. War. However, this week we have people-to-people exchanges, which 2026 is the year of people-to-people exchanges between China and African countries. More about in which areas can we collaborate best and what can each one of us get in return. It's not just about people visiting each other, but how we need to develop these mutual exchanges that then generate, outcomes that bring up, benefit communities, bring up livelihoods, and so on and so forth. So that's what we are doing for this Saturday.
Looking forward to that. Yeah. Robert, what's in the horizon for you?
Well, first of all, Douglas, I'm definitely tuning into that one. That looks like a very interesting show on Talk Africa. A couple of things I'm working on. One is, of course, in the next week, the impact of this conflict on the continent, economically, security-wise. And then, of course, just to wrap up on the 2 sessions and the impact it's going to have here in Africa. For example, we know that in May, China's uplifting all tariffs with African countries that it has relations with is coming into effect. That's going to have a huge, huge impact across the entire continent. We'll be able to import or to export our goods and products into China duty-free. That is huge for the African market, because what that means as well is that coming back here, it means that companies can be able to plan better, more employment, more money, more profits, and also this all works towards economic growth for various countries across the continent. So quite an interesting story, that one.
Can we go ahead and just call it historic? Has there been any nation in history that has done the same thing that China is doing now in terms of lifting these tariffs?
No.
53 African countries, that's no mean.
As far as Africa is concerned, no. It is, isn't it? It's unheard of. Yeah. I think, and this just goes down to China's strategic partnership with Africa. Doug has been talking about strategic partnerships. This is one of those. The strategic partnerships that it's forming with Africa as a whole and with African countries as well, because they're looking forward, not backwards.
Thank you. Allow me to draw this to a close, gentlemen. Thank you so much for helping us understand how conflicts raging on thousands of kilometers away can still shape Africa's economic stability, security, and global partnerships. That has been Douglas Okwach, who is a senior editor for the weekly Talk Africa show, and Robert Nagila, who is a senior reporter here at CGTN Africa. And to you, our listeners, I believe this discussion has been a good reminder of just how interconnected our world has become. That an event in one corner of the world can affect majority of the world's population. You have been listening to the Talk Africa Plus podcast, and we have been focusing on the impact of the Middle East conflict on Africa.